are very happy and honored to host you one of our Startup Istanbul interview series. We have been doing nearly 2 months now, and we have hosted many investors, speakers, authors. So also you were on our list, and we are very happy to see you here.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's always great to connect with the Turkish startup community. I was in Istanbul this past New Year's, just 4 or 5 months ago, and when the world was a very different place. But I enjoyed the city a great deal, and I'm a huge fan of all of the entrepreneurship that's happening in Turkey. And my brother works and lives in Ankara at the U.S. Embassy there, so I also have some family connections to Turkey. So I'm always happy to support all Turkish entrepreneurs and investors.
Perfect. I mean, before going to tough questions about also your experiences and the books and also your fund, how is lockdown going? I mean, for the last couple of weeks and probably months, what have you done so far?
I'd say lockdown and for probably everyone in the world depends a great deal on your circumstances and your the niceness of your house and your infrastructure and all that. So I won't pretend that what I've experienced is as challenging as what many people in the world have. Very lucky to have a relatively large house with a desk to work at and stable internet connection and plenty of food and all that. So I would say relative to many people, it has not been as difficult for me or my family. But obviously there's pain and hurt all around us. And I think it will be a long time until things are back to normal. I'd say it's, for the entrepreneurs thinking about creating businesses in this moment, there are a lot of opportunities to create businesses that can take advantage of some of the new opportunities that have presented themselves, not just in digital health and biology, but also the move to cloud IT for enterprises around the world that are now working from home and all that. So as an investor and entrepreneur, despite all the challenge in lockdown, it's also a very exciting time, I think, to be creating businesses and investing in businesses.
Mm-hmm. You wrote several books, I know the last 2, and you have been working as a writer and also working with the startups. How did you decide to be an investor and create the fund? Should you tell about your fund and also next move and next steps?
Yeah, so we run a venture capital firm called Village Global. We invest, it's a $100 million US dollar venture fund. We invest in startups around the world. We haven't yet invested in Turkey, although we've looked at a couple companies in Turkey, so we're not certainly open to investing anywhere. We invest very early stage, so if you're just a woman and man in a basement with an idea, it's not too early for us. So we like to be the very first investor in a startup, and we'll invest across sectors. So our largest categories are fintech and enterprise SaaS, but we'll invest in a range of things: robotics, consumer internet, digital health. So it's a very diverse portfolio. And what makes Village, our firm, unique is really 2 things. One is all of the money that we invest is the personal capital of some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. So our fund consists of the personal money of people like Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Eric Schmidt, and about 20 other people like that. So it's their money that we're investing. So when you take money from Village, you're in effect taking the money of these iconic entrepreneurs who inspire us all. And then the second thing that makes us different is, we really run as a network. And so the way that we source and select and support a lot of the startups in our portfolio is through a network of people who have different levels of expertise in different areas. And so the way that we invest in cybersecurity or SaaS or fintech is through not myself, but through people who we partner with, angel investors really, who we partner with and empower. And so it's sort of a decentralized model of venture investing, and that's what allows us to invest so broadly and so globally.
How do you select the startups? What is your deal flow, by the way?
Yeah, I mean, what we're looking for is probably similar to what a lot of VCs look for, which is, for our stage, the most important thing is team. So are the entrepreneurs, unbelievably resourceful, unbelievably persistent, unbelievably hungry for realizing the change in the world that they envision. So it's, we make a lot of founder bets, we call it, which are just where the evaluation of the business is basically an evaluation of the person. And so it's a very human process in that regard. So we're always looking at team. I'd say for, international for entrepreneurs based in places like Turkey, we're also looking at market size. If the business vision is to just serve, say, the Turkish market, is that big enough? For our venture fund, and it's not all venture funds, we're looking for businesses that can grow to be worth billions of dollars. And so we often want to back entrepreneurs with ideas that are global in scale, right? So it's, you serve Turkey, and then you serve the Middle East, and then you serve the world, right? It's or Europe. So we were looking for founders with market size, with ideas where the market size is big enough to sustain a huge business. So a small Turkish-only sort of niche company could be a fantastic company, and there are many ways to finance that company. But for raising sort of Silicon Valley style venture capital, we're looking for very big ideas serving ultimately global markets. And so we're backing a founder with a huge idea where the founder's ambition is to turn that idea into a global franchise and a massive multi-billion-dollar company.
Have you already released some of your funds and invested startups?
Yes, we have. Yeah, so we've invested, in actually over 150 companies now. So we have a pretty broad portfolio, and we've invested, tens of millions of dollars in lots of different companies.
And what is the average ticket size? So you have already mentioned about the geography and also stages of the startups, but what's your average ticket size? And do you follow on your first investment amounts?
Yeah, it's a great question, Barak. So we invest we run sort of two products. One is an accelerator, which is like Y Combinator. So if you're applying to Y Combinator now, we're I think different and better in certain ways for certain types of founders. So, but it's very similar to YC, which is we invest $150,000, and then for 7% ownership, and then we will follow on in the next round to maintain our pro rata ownership stake. So that's our accelerator product, $150,000. And then for the seed stage, we'll invest up to $500,000 in the first check. So, relatively small ticket sizes compared to some venture firms, but the goal is to provide enough capital to sort of to build an initial prototype, do some customer development, figure out if the idea is valid, and then we'll help you raise the next round from a seed or Series A investor. And we usually participate in that follow-on round, to your question, Barak, and we'll invest up to $2 million in any single company, but we'll start with a smaller check in the first round.
What works for the startups better, sending you an email, or do you find them in events or recommendation? And which kinds of flow is the most strongest way to reach you and get an investment or a meeting?
Yeah, I mean, the one of the things we talk a little about in our book, The Startup of You, is how to use networks and gain introductions to people. So it's very important to try to use your network to get introductions to the people you want to do business with. So ideally, you get an introduction via to me or any investor you're pitching via someone you know. That's not always possible, in which case a cold email can be perfectly adequate. Of course, there's an art to writing a great cold email. So I'd really research, just Google how to do that if you want to reach out cold to an investor, because there's a way to structure the email and show that you've done your homework and make it personalized. So, a 5-line cold email that says, "Hey, do you want to fund my startup?" That will never work. But a really thoughtful, personalized cold outreach actually can work. There have been plenty of companies that have been funded with that approach.
And by the way, I haven't asked the questions. You have already invested many companies. Is there a kind of geographical distribution? I mean, most of them in US or in Asia or Europe?
Yeah, about 80% of the portfolio is in the U.S. But of the companies out, and of that, most of it's in Silicon Valley. But outside of the U.S., we've invested in all over. I mean, we have 6 or 7 companies in London. We have a company in Bogota, Colombia. Companies in Mexico City, Paris, Singapore, New Zealand. So we're in Tel Aviv. So different geographies, but we've looked at companies in Turkey. I think there's a lot. My friend Chris Schroeder wrote a book, Startup Rising, which I'm sure many of you have read, about Middle East entrepreneurship. So I'm very long-term bullish on the next generation of Turks and folks in neighboring countries and Saudi and elsewhere who can create huge businesses. So we're certainly open for doing business in Turkey.
And whenever you invite, I mean, before of course, this outbreak, and after the outbreak, whenever you do a meeting with founders, what's your red flags and what are your questions? I mean, should you give us hints about your questions in the meetings?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're always looking for a sort of tricky blend of self-confidence and conviction, balanced with openness to feedback and openness to iteration and pivoting. And so on the one hand, when you present your idea, you want to have a real crisp vision for the future, right? How is the world going to be different as a result of your product existing? What problem are you solving? And I find that remains, I've thought this my whole career, framing things in terms of problem solution is by far the best way to frame any pitch. What is the problem in the world? What is your proposed solution? And why does that matter? So, you need to have, on the one hand, a lot of conviction about that thesis. At the same time, almost every single successful startup in history has had to evolve and adapt and pivot as they've grown up. Flickr, the photo sharing website, began as a massive multiplayer online game like World of Warcraft. It had nothing to do with photo sharing. PayPal began as encryption technology on Palm Pilots before they pivoted many times to become a money transfer service online. Starbucks began only selling coffee beans and coffee equipment until they pivoted later to sell coffee by the cup and created an atmosphere where you could actually sit in the coffee shop and drink your cup of coffee. So all successful businesses adapt and change as they grow. And so too will your startup. And so when you're pitching an investor, you also want to convey a certain openness to adaptation and evolution and openness to feedback. And so I'd say balancing that dynamic is something that we look for in pitches.
Perfect. Amal is also online. So let me ask you several questions, and Amal will be also having her questions. So it will be fun to have lots of questions. So it is fine, by the way, Amal. Now the connection is better, and we can see and hear you. And so, Ben, I mean, you know the success stories, especially in Silicon Valley. And you have experience about lots of startups around the world. What is the difference between the Silicon Valley mindset and other countries' mindset? Is it going to be different after this outbreak, by the way?
Well, I certainly think the work from home culture and the global pandemic is good news for ecosystems outside Silicon Valley, because it means there are all these the need to physically be in person in any one place is much lower, right? There are a lot of venture deals that are being done right now that are not having any in-person meetings happening during the pitch. So, the founder could be based in San Francisco, the founder could be based in Ankara or Istanbul, and pitching the same VC in San Francisco, and there's no difference really. Everything's on video chat. So I think there are more opportunities post-pandemic for our ecosystems around the world to raise money from Silicon Valley. I'd say that, the mindset issue, it really comes down to issues like around taking risk and challenging authority and being sort of irrationally optimistic. I mean, those are some of the hallmark traits of Silicon Valley style entrepreneurship. I think there are people who have that mindset all around the world. So Brock, I'm sure you do, and a lot of your colleagues do, and a lot of the companies that you support, those entrepreneurs think that way. So Silicon Valley by no means has a monopoly on a mindset. Anybody can think a certain entrepreneurial way, and I think it's a learnable skill. It helps when you're surrounded by people who can inspire you to think more that way, and by peers who reinforce those habits and those modalities of thinking. It's helpful to have that sort of social network around you, but you don't need to physically be in California to think that way. I've met plenty of extremely entrepreneurial people all throughout Turkey, all throughout the Middle East.
So Amal, do you have questions, rest of the questions?
Definitely. I don't know what you've covered. So hi, Ben. Apologies for my wonderful... I've tried 3 different means and happy that something worked out at the end. So I think I'm going to continue on that line of investment here and what's happening really globally. So I think that most of the startups and what we're hearing today is there's lots of questions like, is it the right time to continue fundraising, for example, or to start a fundraise at this stage? Hearing all of these stories about devaluations, about the fact that a lot of the venture capitals are only doing follow-ons, for example, or doubling down on the companies that they think that they are the superstars. So all of these stuff that they're hearing, and how much time should they really invest, in continuing to fundraise?
Yeah, I would say a couple things. Number one, venture capital funds raise money from other investors, right, called limited partners. And so there are many, many, many venture funds that have raised huge sums of money over the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. And now they are paid by their limited partners to invest that capital. So they're not being paid just to sit on the capital. They sort of have to deploy it in market. So as a result, there's actually, while it's harder to raise a new venture capital fund today, given the macro environment, there are many funds that have already raised capital. And so they need to deploy it. And so there will be a lot of venture capital money invested in startups over the next 3 years. In fact, there might even be an uptick because a lot of investors see this as a great time to invest. Right, coming on the backside of a recession can be a good time to invest and start a company. So there's definitely money out there. There are definitely VCs who are investing. Almost every venture firm that we work with at Village is still investing. And ourselves, over the last 3 months, we've had 18 portfolio companies raise new rounds of financing after our investment. So there's a lot of activity. That being said, there is a higher bar now probably around certain types of businesses. Clearly, like sharing economy type businesses are challenged, right? Is Careem? I assume companies like Careem, et cetera, are struggling this moment. Uber is, Lyft is. So all travel related businesses are struggling. So clearly, there are certain industries that are going to be much harder to fundraise for. But if you're selling if you have a quality value proposition, I wouldn't necessarily abandon your fundraising process. I would actually probably just persist and work as hard as you can to raise the money.
So are we looking at, you said, yes, there is money. Yes, they should continue fundraising, but there is going to be like a much more different approach of from VCs to look at startups, starting from today. And you mentioned a little bit about, some of the sectors. So one of the things that we've noticed even in the region, you're absolutely correct. We've witnessed many deals that were closed actually in the past month. During the pandemic, actually, they decided to close these deals, and they were all known companies that have been already playing. We know that they are really playing a huge role during the pandemic. But I think the question here is, from a VC perspective, how are they going to look? I mean, are we going to look into a new disruptive model of venture capital? I liked what said, in the village, that you're not a traditional fund. You're more of a network. You're more like a value creation. You add much more than a typical VC would add, to a startup. So do you think that we're going to have a much more conscious VCs? Is this wave going to bring a new thinking to venture capital and to GPs, in general? When it comes to that time after or post pandemic,
there might be some changes. I mean, our change, our unique approach is informed by a very sort of deep, I'd like to think, strategy that we developed pre-pandemic that was very long-term in nature. So we have a thesis that how venture capital is going to change over the next 20 years, and we're positioned ourselves to take advantage of those changes. Pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, after the pandemic, like it's almost independent of the pandemic. We have a thesis because ultimately, like my view is, things will never be the same, although a lot will return to normal. A lot will be the same, actually. We tend to overrate the permanence of behavioral changes when we're in the midst of crisis. In the days after September 11th, for example, in America, after the terrorist attacks here, people's like, no one's going to fly again. The airline industry is going to be decimated.
Sure.
It took a couple of years. It all came back. So I'm personally of the view that more is going to be the same than different, 5 years from now. What happens over the next 1 to 2 years, who knows? That's a very murky, scenario. But I think long-term, I think there'll be more of the same that's different. I'd say, I think the main thing that's going to be different for entrepreneurs and founders raising money is the era of in-person meetings and offices might be not over, but seriously diminished. I think it will be more, and I think this is great news if you're in Turkey raising money, right, or as an entrepreneur, because historically there are a lot of VCs in America and London and wherever who needed to meet you in person many times before getting comfortable to make an investment. And what's happening during the pandemic is there are lots of financing happening remotely only. And so it's good news for global entrepreneurship because right now, most of the venture capital money in the world is in China or the US. Yeah. And so to get that money into other people's hands, especially given immigration issues and visa issues, it's going to be much better now to raise money on Zoom or remotely as a founder in Turkey or wherever you're based.
Yeah. So, that been said, of the availability of funding, for some of the venture capitals and the fact that they're going to deploy definitely because their LPs have invested and they need the money. But what about certain communities that don't have access to funding? Do we say that these are really rough times that are coming, on certain parts of the world, or these new means of like virtual access would suddenly maybe open new channels of looking at these startups in certain parts of the world that are trying to innovate and change? Are we going to say or see a much more global kind of view for some of the clustered VCs in certain parts of the world?
There might be. I think there's, look, the trend of global venture capital has been increasing over time. So I would say that long-term trend will just increase, almost independent of the pandemic. Yeah. There are, the central story of my lifetime, I believe, is the rise of the rest, right? It's the relative decline of the importance of Silicon Valley and the US to some degree. And it's the rise of all these other ecosystems around the world because you have 1 billion people using the internet for the first time. We have billions of people who have yet to use the internet. So when you have literally billions of people downloading apps for the first time, that is a massive unserved market, and capital and capitalism will flow to serve that need. So you've got all of these, 300 million people coming out of poverty in China alone. I mean, and there's still poverty around the world. And as those poor people enter the middle class, there is going to be a tremendous amount of opportunity to serve them. And so, I think the amount of venture capital money devoted to Silicon Valley startups as a percentage of the global pie will decrease over time because there'll be more money flowed into these other markets. But that to me has less to do with the pandemic and more to do with just the macroeconomics of globalization. It's all these other countries becoming richer.
Right. And we've seen that there's actually a couple of funds, from Silicon Valley that have started to invest, in the MENA region, and we've seen them coming and scouting, over here, and we've seen also some of the Chinese fund even before the pandemic coming and setting up in the region as well. So this phenomena has kind of started, and it's interesting to see actually what's going to happen, moving forward, and how applicable is that going to be for certain parts of the world. So Ben, I mean, from that perspective of like the startup and the shape of the startup that would be attractive for investors, right? I'm sure during the the pandemic, you've gone through these portfolio companies, you kind of assisted them, you gave them advices, and you run them through certain protocols, if I may say, ways of doing business. We've spoken to a couple of like venture capitals, and everyone said, that was our handbook. This is what we did 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is what we told our startups to do. And that's the way moving forward. But the general scene and everything that we've heard is pretty much resilience and keeping a healthy, cash flow or runway, basically. So how is your way, in your venture capital towards the portfolio companies to get over this time to continue forward, especially with the ones that were not lucky by being 100%, digital?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious things to do are to cut costs and extend your runway, right? Like you want to be thinking about how much money you're spending every month and how long will that last you, et cetera. So, yeah. I mean, staying alive is the first task of any startup. So, cash management is something that we've emphasized as every investor has. I think maybe the non-obvious thing to say is that, the goal of a startup is not just to survive, right? The goal is not just to have a long runway. It's to actually thrive and create a big business. And so at some point, you actually need to invest and play offense, not defense. And so I think there are some founders in the pandemic that have gone to, oh my God, the world's falling apart. I need to cut all my expenses, fire all my employees, and just sort of jump on the lifeboat and try to stay alive and float on top of this tumultuous ocean. But and that may make sense for a period of time, right? Like if you're in a sharing economy kind of business, or the travel business, I mean, your business has come to a complete standstill. But like long term, what's the plan? Because the plan can't be I'm on my lifeboat in the ocean and I've cut all my costs and I'm just staying alive. Like so when is it time to play offense? When do you actually make investments again? When do you hire new people? When do you lean into this? When do you see this as an opportunity? And so, for example, there have been several startups that have been funded just in the last few weeks around helping people monetize video presentations and webinars and doing icebreakers for groups doing video meetings. I mean, this is just an obvious sort of consumer facing niche within the pandemic, but Zoom's monthly, the daily user count is astonishing, right? The number of people who are using, it's the number one app in the iOS Apple Store, Zoom. Like, so you've got, I think they've got 300 million people now a day using Zoom at one point or another. So it's sort of stunning, the growth of these video conferencing technologies. There are a lot of businesses to be built there. So if you're in that space, play offense, invest, try to win. So I think it really depends on how affected your business has been. And if it's been badly affected, then you're going to have to be more conservative.
That's interesting. I mean, it's different scenarios, different lessons, and I think we can't wait to hear more and more about how startup. I think I've heard astonishing stories, in the past period of how they managed to survive, and it's just about getting out there and really finding ways and means, of just staying there. So. There was also another interesting part that I read in one of your blogs, and maybe after that, I'll take you back to the early days. But you were talking about venture capitals, branding as institutions and GPs. And that was really interesting to read. Because when startups really start looking at, VCs and all of that, as you mentioned, they either probably go and maybe look them up, the obvious, the big ones, the known ones. Is it fit? Is it not a fit? But what we're seeing is also an emergence of known people in the ecosystem that are known for being visible, that are known for being good, and they listen to startups and all of that. And I think it's interesting from the two perspectives. One, what the VCs should actually do and how should they look at that, because it's quite an interesting thing to look at, because especially for the micro kind of VCs. And from the startup point of view, should I go after the person or the GP, or should I go after the venture capital as a company?
Yeah, I mean, I think another way to frame that is there are venture capital firms that are highly GP driven, meaning they're highly driven by the personalities and preferences of an individual general partner, right? The partners at the firm. Yeah. And then there are a small number of venture capital firms that run more as institutions than they run as GP-centric partnerships. Village is an example of the latter. So we run as an institution, meaning the power is not all concentrated in, for example, me. Like, I don't make all the investment decisions. So there are many ways to get funded by Village, but it's not all about just pleasing me. But we are an exception. Most venture firms are GP-centric. And so when you're pitching a venture capital firm, you're really pitching an individual person. You're pitching an individual partner at the firm, and you're trying to understand the previous investments they've done, their background, their thesis, their beliefs, and you're trying to convince them as an individual human being to back you. And sometimes they have to get partnership approval, or multiple people have to approve, but it's a very personal process. And so I wouldn't get overly, to this point, Amal, like I don't advise founders to get overly focused on the firm brands or the firm strategies, and then more focus on the individual humans who you're pitching.
Interesting. I mean, it's a very important point, and it's highly confusing for a lot of startups, most of the time, especially the first timers that are actually raising, when they look at that. But I like the way that you put it, because if the persons or the GPs are making the decisions, you obviously then need to understand them really well, pretty much like you understand your customers, that you're targeting in any market.
I would just say, Amal, if I can, because I'm just seeing some of the chats, I should have said we did fund a company in Nigeria. There's a guy from Nigeria on, the former founder of Andela. We funded them. And then we've also funded a company in Pakistan called Airlift, which is being affected by COVID. But it's good to have people from both Pakistan and Nigeria here. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. That's great. That's really great. It's good to actually hear, and it's good that that you invest in different parts of the world, and I hope they do well, during this time and afterwards as well. So there's a part that that I want to take you back to the early days. You being an entrepreneur at an early age, trying and experimenting and wanting to really solve a lot of problems and all of these issues before owning also your own company. And I think in this whole journey, and reflecting even on the startup of you and the skills and the traits of any entrepreneur, this is a question that's often asked as well. How can I really learn all of these stuff? Looking at successful entrepreneurs, how did they cultivate all of these skills? And we find out that there is parts of their lives that have actually put them in certain situations where they have to sharpen these skills by trying and experimenting and being hustlers, if I may say. But for entrepreneurs that haven't really gone through that much, let's say, are these traits, things that we can teach and we can try, or is it just about the mindset really that we have, and it could actually drive all our actions in order to succeed in our companies?
Well, the most highlighted sentence in the Startup of You on the Kindle edition of the book, so we can track it that way, is the sentence is, the fastest way to become the person you want to be is to surround yourself with people who are already that way. Yep. So the fastest way to become the person you want to be in the future is to surround yourself by people who already exhibit the traits that you aspire to have. And another way to put that, which is a quote you often see circulating, is you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time around. And so both framings reinforce the central idea of social osmosis, the idea that the people you're surrounded with influence you to a great degree. So obviously, who you choose to marry or who you choose to befriend and spend a lot of time with in your personal life will have a huge impact on you. But then also which sort of business contacts and acquaintances you choose to spend time with, which mentors you choose to have in your life, which boss you choose to work for. Those people have tremendous influence on you. And so to this question of, can you learn entrepreneurial skills? Yeah, I think you can learn almost anything. It's a lot harder to learn entrepreneurial skills if you're surrounded by people who are not supportive of your learning those skills, or who in their own behavior do not reinforce the habits that you are trying to inculcate in your own life. And so ideally you can learn the skills in the way you'd learn anything, reading books, watching webinars, etc. But then also you can ideally befriend people in your life who will support that learning process and even model behavior to you. And if you don't have anyone in your life now who does that, or you have only a few, or there are not many people in your neighborhood or your city or your country, the good news with the internet is that you can meet people all around the world, and you can find people who think the way you think, or think the way that you want to think in the future. So I'd be highly attentive with respect to learning these skills. I'd be highly attentive to your social network. Really think about, who do you want to be spending time with, and do their beliefs are those beliefs that you want to have? Because if you spend enough time with someone, you'll start to think like them, talk like them, act like them. And so if you want to change who you are, you want to become a more entrepreneurial, go surround yourself with more entrepreneurial people.
Absolutely. And I'm a big believer of that. And I see Burak joining. He's probably joining with a bunch of questions as well from people. But I'll hit a last question, Burak, if we still have time.
Yes, go ahead, please, Amal.
Yeah. So in your journey, Ben, there's definitely a component of the fear of not being good enough, or the fear of failing. And I think, this is one of the most, and the biggest challenges in probably some of the regions here is, how do I really stop myself? You've mentioned surrounding yourself. That could actually help a lot, being around these people, being around other startups and all of these stuff. But I think, I wonder if in your personal journey, you have been actually confronted with fear of failing at any point, and how did you really deal with that over time?
Well, I think the fear of failing is human nature. I think everyone has that. I think there are, to sort of parlay a quote from well, it was once attributed to Mike Tyson, the boxer. I'm not sure who actually said it, but fear can be a good thing. It's like fire; it can cook your food. It can also burn down your house. So you need some element of fear actually to stay motivated. And so anybody who tells you they don't fear failure or fear disappointment is probably lying to you. At the same time, if you let it become a sort of totalizing force in your psychology, right? If it takes over your mind, it's very unhelpful, very dangerous place to be, and you'll unlikely have the courage to actually try new things, and thus you'll be unlikely to succeed. I think for me, when I think about fear as an emotional dynamic, it often has to do with a competition. And when you start, certainly in the companies and projects that I've started, and even all the way till today with Village, we have competition, and so there's always an element of fear around: are we better? Can we be better? Are we cheaper, faster, stronger than the competition? And in a capitalistic, market-based economy, that's the essence of how winners and losers get sorted, right? There's a competitive dynamic, and so as an entrepreneur, you have to confront that. And so if you don't have competition for the idea that you're thinking about, it's probably not a very good idea. If you think you're the only person in the world that's thought of something, it's probably flawed in some way. So as a founder, at least as I've been a founder and now running Village, we have competition. There's been other companies trying to sell similar products to ones I've sold, and there are other venture firms trying to back the same entrepreneurs that we're trying to back. So that's a good thing because it means that we're onto something, but also we have to sort of grapple with the idea that there are competitors and sometimes it can get ugly or personal or emotional, that competition, and being able to manage your psychology around that is pretty important.
And I think that's the key over here. It's managing your psychology and not letting fear really control you, because fear of failure will always be there. And I think when you were talking about it, Ben, you were kind of smiling, and it kind of, I think there's energy that comes with that fear, and it means you care about that cause. It means you really want it to happen. And if you're not afraid, then that's problematic probably. So I think from that key, we'll take it to Barak, who I think you see a bunch of questions, Barak, aren't you? I'm not going to be able to, unfortunately, finish everything I prepared, but let's give it to you over here.
So we have a bunch of questions and also audience questions as well. Alex is here, by the way. Ben, your brother, I think, is also.
Oh, good. Yeah. So if you guys have you guys ever need someone to talk to in Ankara, feel free to reach out to him. He's in the attendee list.
So Ozan has a question, by the way. He's online. He can ask the question. He will be online. But I have a quick question before the audience questions from Ozan. What motivates you to wake up in the morning, Ben?
What gets me to wake up in the morning?
Yes.
I'm not sure I have a choice, given I've inhabited this human body that needs to eat, drink, and go to the bathroom and all that. So I'd say there's a basic biological propulsion to sort of get up and start my day and live. I think to answer the question more metaphorically, what drives me, I'd say, primarily it's an interest in learning and curiosity. There's so much to learn about the world, to learn about oneself, that's what sort of most excites me in the morning. It's what am I going to learn today? So a day that's not filled with learning is not a very fun day for me.
Ozan, your last questions for this interview, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, seeing that everyone except Amal has that hair day, I took up my hat. So,
what are you saying about my hair? Are you're critiquing my hair?
It's gonna be better.
You should tie it.
Yeah, but I wish I have to use my daughter's things, but it doesn't still tie up. So my question to Ben is, I mean, I lived in San Francisco for 3 years, and I've seen a lot of things that will only happen in San Francisco. And many people were still coming, like flocking, because the investors there had a 50-mile radius investment range, that's what they said. Now, as you mentioned a little earlier, that's about to change, at least in the first 2 years of how we're going to move on. Do you think that will create a balance of disproportionate balance of talented people that needs to spend $3,000 on a one-bedroom in San Francisco, but instead they move out somewhere else, even they have access to San Francisco? How would founders plan out their life, because now they don't have to live in San Francisco, if that's the case you mentioned?
Do you live in Turkey now?
I moved back, yeah.
Yeah. So I think there'll be a big shift. I think these places, the problem with the San Francisco Bay Area is the housing policy is so backwards that there's not been enough new housing built to accommodate demand. And so, as you said, prices are very, very high. And I think that this whole process of COVID-19 will lead to people leaving these dense metropolitan areas. I mean, I think New York City is going to be the hardest hit here. I was talking to some friends, 4 or 5 of them are all leaving New York City. They say at least for a year or two, but that might just become permanently, right? Once you've set up shop in Los Angeles or Miami or somewhere else, it's hard to go back, I think. So the ultra dense, public subway driven cities like New York City or London, I think are going to be really challenged. And so I think it's ultimately good news for people who live in other parts of the world. I mean, I think, as we mentioned a little earlier in the conversation, I don't think VCs in the Valley anymore are able to enforce the 50-mile radius thing that you mentioned, Ozan, because there's talent everywhere. And it doesn't matter if you're in Istanbul or in San Francisco. If you're both on a Zoom call with the VC, it's the same thing. So now, of course, there are some important questions around if you're starting a company, which market are you serving, where are your customers, et cetera. And so the US market remains, massive and appealing for many reasons, especially in enterprise software. So, a founder in Turkey serving only the Turkish market, trying to raise money from a Silicon Valley VC, that will be challenging unless there's a global vision. But at least it's not disqualifying to just be living in Istanbul or Ankara or wherever. Like you at least can have the opportunity to make the pitch. And so if you have a big vision and you're global in your scope of thinking, I think there'll be new possibilities after this pandemic.
I agree. I hope so. We'll see how, as you said, if things will try to go back to normal or not. We'll see, and we'll live through it.
Yeah.
So Ben and also Amal and Ozan, thank you very much. And this was a great interview. Ben, hope to meet you back in Istanbul after these all outbreak completes, hopefully in fall or next year.
That's
and
good.
We will be very happy to welcome you back in Istanbul, and also lots of startups expected to meet you for your new fund and also investing opportunities as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.